Hello and welcome to another FutureBuild webinar. My name is Peter Sumpton. I'm a construction industry marketing consultant, and I'm delighted to be joined by 5 amazing guests who I'll introduce in a moment. Got a bit of admin to get through first. We want you to get value and get involved in this webinar as much as possible. So we've got a few things that might help you to do this. First of all, if you have a question, there's a question tab on this webinar. So you can use this Q&A function to ask your questions, and we'll answer them or do our best to answer them at the end. If we don't get time, we will get back to you after the webinar finishes. So your question will get answered. You can actually vote for your favorite question, which means that this question will stay on top of the pile, and it gives it more chance of being answered today live. Secondly, you can check out our poll section, which again is on the right-hand side of this webinar. There's just a few short polls to gather some intel from you, the construction industry in general, and what you think on particular topics related to today's discussion. And finally, there's a chat function, and I can see a lot of people saying hello and good afternoon already, which is fantastic. Use it to do just that. Say hello, introduce yourself, be friendly. Let us know where you are in the world, who you work for, and more importantly, why this discussion is important to you. Let's get this dialogue rolling. So just a quick note about today's sponsor before I introduce the panelists. So the webinar today is sponsored by the BBA, the British Board of Agreement. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with the BBA, they help construction and manufacturing organizations build confidence in the solutions they design, create, implement throughout the entire construction industry supply chain. How do they do this? Well, they do it through testing, certification, auditing and inspections, offering management system solutions. So they're in a prime place to take on today's webinar title, which is Supporting the Construction Supply Chain, how changes to certification and testing are supporting the industry for a safer future, which I think we can all agree is massively important. Okay, so that's enough from me. Let me introduce the panelists. First of all, we have the CEO of the BBA, Hardy Giesler.
Afternoon, everybody.
Hardy, could you just give us a brief introduction to yourself?
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, before I introduce myself, thank you to all the panelists who've joined us today. BBA is very grateful for the time you have spent on preparing for that and for participating. BBA, as Peter Sumpton has already said, a product certification body, although we do a lot of things not only with products, but with people as well, and rapidly expanding that, and hopefully we'll touch a little bit more on that later on.
Fantastic. I'm going to go to Neil next. Neil is construction lead at the National Composite Centre. Neil, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for the kind introduction. So I've spent about half my career working in the construction sector on design and construction, and then roughly half of my career in the composite supply chain, both in the construction sector and also oil and gas. I work for the National Composite Centre. So we're a research and technology organisation, part of the High Value Manufacturing Catapult that some of you may know about, and we're quite sizable. And we work to take technologies that relate to composites through from proof of concept through to industrial demonstrator.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Neil. Okay, I'm going to hand over to the COO at the Structural Timber Association, Andrew.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Peter. And thanks for the opportunity of being on the panel today. It's much appreciated. I'm truly in the company of the great. Having just heard Neil's explanation of what he does makes mine a little more mundane, I fear. 40 odd years in the construction industry. I know, difficult to believe when you look this young. Much of it around technical, the technical side of construction. And I'm currently working with the Structural Association on their helping them with their quality assurance program, as well as sort of general operational issues. And I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you.
Fantastic. Okay, next up is the BDM at Celsa Steel UK, Jamie. Welcome, Jamie.
Hi, thanks for having me on. It's a great opportunity. I work for Celsa UK, who are the major manufacturer of reinforcing steel in the United Kingdom. I've been with the business for 32 years. I've worked in quality management, technical management, environmental management, and all levels of certification in that time. And I hope I can add something to this discussion.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Jamie. And finally, I'm going to hand over to the CEO of SPRA, Ronan.
Thank you, Peter, and good afternoon, everybody. It really is a pleasure to be invited along today. My name is Ronan Brunton, and I represent the Single Ply Roofing Association. And I've been in the single ply roofing industry for the last 30 plus years. I have a civil engineer training background, but my work at SPRA is to represent our members, who are both product manufacturers and indeed installing specialist contractors in the roofing sector, the single ply roofing sector of the industry. So it's a pleasure to be along here today, and hopefully I can add to the discussion as it takes place. Thank you.
Marvelous, fantastic. I'll bring us all up onto the screen now. So let's get into the good stuff, shall we? The actual bulk of the discussion today. And then, like I said at the start, we'll end with a Q&A. So if you have got any questions for people watching, please use the Q&A function as well as the poll function on the webinar to let us know what you think, and keep that dialogue and the chat going. It's great to see some people saying that certification and testing is absolutely vital. And that's what we're going to get into, and trying to make the construction industry safer for the future. So what I'd like to start with is a brief look at testing and certification within construction industry in general right now. And I'm going to go to Hardy first. Hardy, through 30 years of manufacturing and services industry knowledge, how relevant is testing and certification within construction today?
Thanks, Peter. Like Andrew, I think the 30 years must sound a little bit make up, Andrew. So the product certification is growing rapidly. To just put some scale on that, I started in the business 2 years ago. By end of this year, our throughput will be double of what it was when I started just over 2 years ago. We're investing heavily to make that process easier for our clients, the manufacturers of product. Over the 2 past years and this year, so over the 3-year period, we are spending and investing as much in the business as we earned as operating income in the 10 years prior to that. So significant investment going into the business. A lot of that is in building our skills base further, but also building our digital infrastructure so we can make information available more readily to the right audience at the right time in the right format, that they can get benefit from that information. So why do we say it's increasing so much? One is those who carry the risk in the industry, the warranty providers, the insurers, the lenders. We're actively engaged with those. They want to understand how they can reduce their risks by better understanding and certifying the products that are used. Government, so you may all be aware that the government is setting up a new construction product regulator called OPSS. And we're working with OPSS, DLOC, BAYS, and the Treasury to see how best we can make that work for the industry. And just maybe some reasons as to why this is happening. The first one is product proliferation. There are a lot of new products coming to market. I'll maybe mention a few that are, some are on the market and some are on their way. So we've just worked with a company called Insulfix. For those of you who have ever tried to fit a foam panel between roof rafters, maybe it was just me, but it's quite a tricky job. And Insulfix has come up with a plastic fitting, fits over the rafters with a spring-loaded part to it. You squeeze the panel in and it seals it, and the thermal performance is way better than it would be if you try and do it by hand and then fill in the gaps with a bit of spray foam. There's another company called Biom we're working with at the moment. Their product is far from ready for certification, but we are helping them, and they have 2 products. One is called Orb, ORB, which basically uses food byproducts that are hard to use in any other way or to recycle, like orange peel, broken up nuts, walnuts, etc. And they add a specific glue and turn that into a sheet boarding. Another one called Mycelium, which is taking other waste products and adding mushrooms to it, believe it or not, and they grow insulation panels, which by weight and by insulation and by fire performance outperform the more traditional solution quite significantly. Work to do to bring that to market, but some very, very exciting products. So the BBA visits more than 50 countries every year in factory visits and assessing the products that ultimately end up on the UK construction market. That's a big selection of products. The second reason is products are becoming more complex materials being used, combinations of materials being used. The third one is products are used in combination. So when you look at external cladding, you have fixings, you have insulations, you have cladding, you have coating. All these things, as we have seen from Grenfell, there is quite a level of complexity involved in this. And if people get those wrong, the consequences can be disastrous. It's very important that people understand that. So more and more of the work we do now is not looking at products in isolation. We do assess those because that's the start of the chain, but then also look at those products being used in combination with other products. It is very likely that they will perform differently. And the last one is, for those of you who have been watching the setting up of the Code of Construction Product Information, CCPI, which was originally set up by the CPA and is now being managed by Amanda Long. That's an indication that the information out there is probably not as good as it can be or as clear as it can be. And that's one other area where the BBA, through its certification process, also tries to make the information more readily accessible and more readily digestible. So you can imagine that a contractor trying to finish a job on site on the Friday afternoon, needing to substitute a product that is no longer in stock or is too expensive, will have a very different requirement from an architect designing a new building. We need to speak to both of those audience and a lot of other audiences as well. That is the job in hand for us at the moment.
Fantastic. Thanks for that run through, Hardy. What I'd like to move on to next is kind of look at the value in testing and certification throughout the entire supply chain. And I'm going to come to Andrew first on this. Andrew, I know back in your SIG days, you were instrumental in setting up the technical centre, looking to take cost and complexity out of construction. And that's certainly something that adds a lot of value and benefits the entire supply chain in some way, shape or form. So let's just building on that knowledge and understanding. Where is testing and certification adding value now?
Yeah, that's a nice and easy question, and Hardy's actually covered some of it. But I think from my personal experience, particularly more recently with the Structural Timber Association, the value in both of these things only exists if it's actually the right type of testing and the right type of certification. If I take testing to begin with, for example, the right type of testing is touching on what Hardy's just said about the difference between components and systems, is there's a risk that we all feel great because there's a product on the market that's actually being tested against a certain criteria. But actually, is that criteria relevant in the context in which it's being used? And does it actually have the same positive contribution, assuming, of course, it passes the test, the same contribution to the system in which it's been incorporated into? And I think post Grenfell and Dame Judith's report is that we do, as an industry, need to think more of in terms of systems rather than components. And that in itself creates an interesting environment for the supply chain to come together and collaborate with testing. I'll just give you a little example of that. In 2019, STA commissioned a testing program, which is quite unusual for a trade association to embark upon a product testing program. It's normally in the gift of the members to do their own testing, but with the increasing concern about combustible materials, etc., STA took the decision that we would embark on this program. And actually, what you do in a European testing standard, in a laboratory testing standard, to establish, say, the fire performance of an external wall, is you build that wall using a number of different components, all with their own testing criteria. And Structural Timber Association were able to collaborate with quite a few of those component suppliers in terms of pulling together a suite of generic solutions, which were then tested. So it is a wall system that's actually been tested. And then more recently in 2020, SDA carried out an 8414 test, which for those who aren't familiar, it's a full height building, really quite an aggressive 60-minute test, where it replicates a compartmental fire that escapes out of a window and shoots up the outside of the building. And again, we had quite a lot of collaboration with like the cavity barrier industry, the insulation industry, etc., to prove performance. And it was a proven performance system, which I think is where the value is. That value, in terms of something again that Harley mentioned, is of significance when you look at the stakeholder community. I think we are all more than aware that the insurance industry is in a hard market right now. We see that with our insurance premiums right the way across the piece, from buildings in use to buildings under construction, i.e. constructional risks, and even PI insurance. They need a reference point that they can say with confidence that the system in which the building is going to be constructed has a tested and proven performance. And that gives them the confidence then to make a judgment in terms of the size of the risk, etc. So there's clearly significant value for the stakeholder community. When we look at certification, there are, again, very, very similar values in certification as there are in testing. It's about providing confidence to stakeholders that the product has been appropriately tested and is fit for purpose in the application in which it is intended. But we are, again, in a situation where if I took something random like a fire door, for example, and said, well, I've got the glass in this fire door that's been tested to a certain standard and it's great, but it's not been tested in a timber door, but it's the fire door that's been used as the fire escape protection element. So it is about all of these components coming together in a certification environment in the same way as it comes together in a testing environment. And I think that's important to recognize those kind of things. In certification as well, I think that there is true value in the certification that is placed on a system is appropriate for the way in which it's been used. I've been, as I said earlier, been around the block enough to have seen situations which people have wafted a certificate in front of a client and say, no, it's BBA approved, but not for the application in which it's been used. But nobody wants to know about that because they're just looking for a rubber stamp on a piece of paper that says, yeah, I've got a BBA certificate for this, this is fine. Not in the app, because the BBA certificate may have been scoped differently to the application in which that product's being used. So I think the true value in certification is making sure that the certificate applies to the application in which those products or systems are being used. I think certification as well gives the product gravitas. It's recognition that the supplier of that product or system has actually invested in that system to have that proving done, to have that third party peer review of their claims. And the CCPI very much highlighted that kind of activity about the claims not matching necessarily the performance, and it's vital we get all of those things properly bound together. But that recognition of that supplier having certification for their system, again, triggers the stakeholders' confidence as much as actually giving that particular supplier some credence in the marketplace and therefore value. The final bit, which is supply chain, I think again, you hardly may have touched upon this, but you can produce the finest product in the world, but if it's put together by a chimpanzee, it probably won't actually perform in the way it was intended. And it was something that STA recognized about 6 years ago in developing something called STA Assure, which is it's their own competency and compliance program. And this is seen to have value by the likes of NHBC, Premier Guarantees, LABC Warranties, etc., who recognise that actually if a structural timber building is constructed by an STA member who's mandated to work under the STA Assure programme, is that there is a level of guaranteed competency and skill in the way that building's being constructed. And that's provided huge value to the STA members. It's also provided value to the likes of the warranty providers, who seek some comfort that they're not about to warrant a building for 10 years that hasn't been necessarily put together correctly, even though the components themselves are all perfectly manufactured in accordance with their own standards. So I think we shouldn't be blindsided by great components, certified, tested components put together by somebody who hasn't got a clue what they're doing. And that for me is a vital part of the supply chain as any. And I'm proud to say that being part of STA, we have a program that addresses that. So that would be how I see the value in those three elements to that question, Peter.
Fantastic. I'm just going to jump to Jamie for a second here, just to follow up on that. Jamie, you're in the steel reinforcement industry. Is it a similar thing in that the testing and certification is very much a system-led approach as it is the individual components, and the installation is vital within that process?
Absolutely, yeah. But I see testing and certification as two quite different things. In the reinforcement industry, we test hundreds of samples a day. The British standards, ask us to do that, but we go way, way, way beyond those levels in order to get the assurance we require. And a quality audit by a certification body is just a snapshot of what you do as a business. So you need to be sure on a daily basis, almost on an hourly basis, that what you do is within specification. And the other thing that I add is that, things have changed in the last 30 or 40 years. 40 years ago, the steel industry was a little bit like the Wild West. It's not so anymore. Everything is digitalized. All the testing results are digital. You can't actually change one. They're all there to be seen. It is what it is. And that gives you the opportunity to improve, because if you do find a failure, you act upon the failure and you report on the failure. I remember when I started, if you found a failure, the first thing you thought about was how you hid it. It's changed. It's not like that anymore. It's moved on, and the digitalization of the testing process, as I say, has given an absolutely genuine set of figures, a set of data that can't be challenged. And a certification authority such as the BBA comes in, takes a snapshot, but actually verifies that what you've done in the previous 6 months also meets the specification and that you're acting responsibly. So I think that's a point that we're used to testing a lot of samples, or testing a lot of steel, because it's the right thing to do. And the certification is absolutely vital in terms of third-party verification. Of course it is.
Yeah. Absolutely. So just sticking with you for a second, Jamie, in terms of tying this all together right through a supply chain, if we take steel reinforcement, for example, how's testing and certification helping with this? I'm guessing digital has its part to play, like you alluded to, but is there anything else that you can mention in terms of that longer supply chain and where testing and certification fits in?
Yeah, what I'll do is I'll just quickly walk you through our process. So we take recycled scrap metal and we take it to an electric arc furnace and we turn it into molten steel. And at that point, that molten steel is given an identification number, and then it goes into, it gets rolled into a billet, and then it gets rolled into coil or bar, and it retains that unique number throughout this process. It then goes to a fabricator and is shaped, welded, cut, bent, made into mats. All sorts of different things happen to it. And then it gets delivered to a construction project. And it's a safety critical material. If it fails, a building fails, a structure fails. So at every point of that journey, we have to know where it's from, how it's used. Back to your point, Andrew, about who's put it together. Are they trained? Are they competent within the process? Is it a competent process? So it's vital, absolutely vital, that the whole of the supply chain is integrated and joined. So yeah, that's just an example of what we do. I'm sure that is the same in other sectors. It's got to be, but we need to know at every step of the way where that unique number is. And bear in mind, we might produce dozens of unique numbers every day in a steel mill, and they end up in 40 different fabricators around the UK. We still need to know exactly where that unique number, whether it's 1 ton of it, or because a melt, if you like, or a heat or a cast of steel, in our case, is about 150 tons at a time. That 150 tons may go to one major fabricator. It may be split between 10 different fabricators. So we need the knowledge to know where it is. And if there is an issue, how we trace it back to where the problem was. So without integration of the supply chain in terms of certification, it's not effective. Hope I've answered that.
Yeah, of course, absolutely. And I just want to go back to Andrew to go full circle. Andrew, is this the same in structural timber in terms of the full supply chain and where testing and certification fits in?
Yes, it is. It certainly not with the intensity that Jamie's world has in terms of breaking down that minutiae, but I think the certification system certification. Well, if I could put into context with STA and the STA Assure program, there is without doubt that STA members are able to win work that is perhaps not as non-members may not be able to be in such an advantageous position because it's market perceptions. There is an increasing demand from the market that systems and all sorts of components are tested and certified. There is, in fact, an expectation now that that is the case, and it really is in the fringes of the industry where non-certified or non-tested products are used with any degree of proliferation. I think the contradiction in some respects is with certification, particularly, is that balance that BBA have to that fine line that BBA have to walk, is the diligence going into the certification process versus the demand to have a certificate quite quickly to bring a product to market. And for as long as I can remember, that's always been, a challenge where, as an industry, we're encouraged to innovate, but then actually it becomes quite slow. I've always taken a rather unpopular view that BBA need to do what they need to do to make sure the certificate is both robust and has the kind of gravitas that you would expect. But it is a contradiction, and that diligence in certification must be maintained, in my view, to continue to be the thread through what we do. I've kind of gone off-piste a little bit there, but you take my point.
Absolutely. So I just want to move the conversation on a little bit more.
Peter, could I just respond to Andrew's comment, please?
Of course, yeah.
Andrew, absolutely right that the content of the certificate has to be, and the quality has to be maintained. Having said that, if I look at the process time we have and the proportion of content time within that, there is definitely room for improvement. And that's why we're investing heavily in digitization of the work environment to improve our response times. We do want to make that turnaround time as quick as possible without compromising the quality of that certificate.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think some of that brings us into the next topic. And I'm going to go to Neil to start us off on this one. Neil, you have a background in civil and structural engineering, design and construction. So what role do you feel testing and certification has to play as an innovation enabler?
Yeah, it's a great topic, and it's so close to our heart at NCC in that RTO role, which is a little bit disjointed to the supply chain. And if I could just follow on from the previous question, something that we've identified a need for as we go through these multiple steps of developing materials, applications, and so on, we've kind of recognized that we need an earlier engagement, both with the regulating body and particularly the test and certification bodies. The modern world dictates that actually you want to start doing these as a more parallel program than a series program. Otherwise, you're taking years and years to get product to market, which is not going to hit 2050 targets. Well, they're sooner targets, aren't they? So to pick up on that particular question, we're seeing a sector that's transforming nicely, quietly in the background, responding to these needs of better productivity, better performance, and particularly sustainability. And I think most people in the audience will be familiar. That's driving technologies often with different names describing the same thing, around manufactured approaches, off-site manufacture, all empowered by digital technologies, which have really come to the forefront in construction. But particularly close to our hearts and interest is the use of new materials, transfer of materials from other sectors, and so on and so forth. And suffice to say, and I think so Hardy set the scene for this very, very nicely. I'm refreshed to find that there is this massive growth in demand for doing things differently and bringing innovations through. You can't necessarily shoehorn genuine innovations into that existing regulatory model and the testing and certification that has evolved to sit under it. You need to do something different, and that is very much the gap that the independent test and certification houses such as BBA, Kiwa and such like fill extremely well. An example of just to show an example of something that we're working on is the use for fairly basic architectural features of plant fiber composites in bio-derived polymers, so hemp fibers and things of this nature, for things like reveals, nothing desperately onerous. Very, very difficult to fit into a system that is built around the itinerant materials, which are powder-coated aluminium. Even where we're seeing technology transfer of taking composite structural elements that are used for things like bridge decks or in widespread use, to use them for floor cassettes in housing is difficult because the regulatory framework says, well, where's the Eurocode for this? And at the moment, it's a work in progress. And even when it's done, it will be difficult to say, well, does that Eurocode actually apply to the floor of a house, or is it still out with that regulatory? And it all follows through that chain of, has it been tested? Has it been certified? Will the insurance underwriter underwrite it? Will the regulator accept it? Will the mortgage provider fund it? So in terms of what we do around that, taking us through the TRL steps from proof of concept to demonstrator, we tend to keep one eye on regulatory, but really try to understand the underlying performance that is required from the application, the thing that we're developing, and address that underlying performance. And where possible, as I say, try to engage earlier with the regulator and the test and cert houses so that they're on board with the process, rather than us reaching the end of that serial program of, yeah, we've got to an industrial demonstrator, off you go, to actually having the next stages well in place. Hardy identified very, very nicely, Andrew picked up on it as well, systems rather than individual artifacts. Quite often we're developing an individual article. We're doing a lot of work with rebar at the moment. That's composite rather than the steel rebar that Jamie's dominates with. And as a system with concrete, it behaves very, very differently to steel. And you need to step back and look at not only what performance is required, but how could this fail in a different way as a system? So it brings in questions in things like rebar around, does that cementitious environment make the bond behave differently over time? Because we're dealing with fibers, we're dealing with polymers. Does it behave differently? And how do you test for that? So to sum up, we're seeing a sector that's transforming greatly, adopting new ways of constructing, adopting new materials, using existing materials differently, transferring materials in from other sectors. As the appetite to innovate gets more, and we're seeing smarter and smarter thinking, that that becomes even harder to fit within that existing framework, and puts more demand on those independent testing houses to put in test programs and certification to support it. And we are very keen to work earlier with the regulator and those certification bodies, so that everything is nicely aligned to get the best results.
Fantastic. Ronan, I think you're the final one to speak on any topic, so welcome to the conversation once again. In your opinion, from what you've seen, I know you sit on various committees and with your work with SPRA, are you seeing testing and certification being that enabler that drives innovation forward, or can it sometimes be prohibitive?
Well, thanks, Peter, and I think Neil has given a very, good explanation there in terms of, the innovative streak that runs through testing and certification. And in my opinion, testing and certification is strongly linked to innovation, in the sense that to progress from stage to stage in the development of an innovative product, system, or concept, you need to be sure that you're meeting all the required conditions and standards along the way that are relevant. So, in effect, a company cannot go too far into the research and development of a new product without being sure that the end result is going to meet all of the required standards. So the product needs to be on the right path early on in the process for that to happen. And therefore, testing along the way may well be essential. So clearly, it is very strongly linked to innovation, because you can't really progress the whole process without keeping it very close, or keeping the new product or the innovative product very close to the target standard that's required. One note of caution that when the enabler can turn to be prohibitive if we're not careful, and that it must be stressed that it can be a hurdle in the sense that if the testing plan is not well thought out, on the basis of having the cost is too high of testing, or is prohibitive, or if there isn't enough capacity in the system, in the testing system, that can be an issue for manufacturers to take their product to market, because it's either too expensive, or it's not timely enough, or. And I know the likes of the BBA is working, as Hardy mentioned earlier, significantly in these areas, particularly on the capacity element and prompt response to companies, to try and make sure that the company is getting the feedback, to try and progress the whole idea of bringing the innovative product to market. And I think Neil touched on it as well, that the innovation side is strongly linked to engagement. And we'll see testing and product development have to work in parallel, as has already been mentioned, as opposed to being in series. So that would be my take on that particular issue, Peter, from the innovative product development point of view.
Fantastic. Thanks for that, Ronan. I just want to say that for anybody that's just joining us or has joined us recently, please use the Q&A section if you want to ask a question, which we'll try and get to all of them at the end, although I've seen a fair few come in. So if we don't get a chance to ask them, we will get back to you after the webinar. Use the chat function to say hello. We've got people in all over the UK, London, Cardiff, Dublin, and we've got people coming from Ghana as well, which is superb to see. Finally, the poll section. There's a few polls there. We're just trying to generate a bit of intel in terms of what the industry, the construction industry, thinks of some of the topics we're discussing today. So I want to move on to challenges facing testing and certification. And back to Hardy. You've been with the BBA, or the CEO of the BBA, for around about 3 years now. So what are the current challenges within testing and certification at this moment in time? Oh, you're on mute, Hardy. You have to put a pound in the meter.
Thanks, Peter. So
There we
the challenges to do with testing are significant. We Post Grenfell, I think the need for testing, independent testing, has been identified as a very important aspect of how we respond. Post Brexit, subject to some further government clarification, the demand for testing to be carried out within the UK is unknown at this stage. It is expected that it may be a significant bottleneck come the beginning of 2023, which is only about 8 months away. BBA has tried very hard to understand what the capacity, the capability, and the competence for testing is in the UK, but no one seems to know that. And that in some ways makes sense, because this testing was sourced all over Europe for many a decade, and now suddenly it all has come to the UK. We don't really understand what the capacity is, and we're spending a big chunk of cash at the moment to try and get to understand what the market has to offer in the UK, and in return, what the BBA may have to offer alongside that to make sure sufficient capacity is available. We also, in response to Dame Judith Hackett's report at the beginning of last year, we went out to consultation with the market and saying, with particular application for higher risk residential buildings or higher risk buildings, particularly to do with strength and fire, of course, how does the BBA Agreement certification need to be improved to meet the specific needs of those structures? We went to the market with 4 recommendations. All 4 were accepted. All 4 involve enhanced testing to some degree. The first one is we get involved earlier through the new product development. Secondly, we are present at critical tests, fire tests, etc. Thirdly, we keep some kind of record of what was tested, a chemical analysis or a fingerprinting. And the fourth one is post-certification testing. Now, of course, that has a cost associated with that, but I was very pleased to see that both the end users, the architects who specify, local authorities, the warranty providers, financial institutions, as well as those who actually pay for those services, which is the manufacturers, supported that 4th recommendation as well. So this is all good news, because I think 2 things as far as the Agreement certification is concerned. One is the testing quality has to be high, and we have to continue to strive to improve that. Quality of testing equates to the quality of product assessment and certification, arguably. And the second point is that the testing itself has to be something we actively participate in, whether an observer or as someone providing the testing. But I think the time of when desktop-based assessment and certification of products was sufficient is probably no more. So the role of testing is increasingly becoming more important, plus the demand for testing, subject to government clarification, is also likely to increase significantly in the short to medium term. So hopefully that gives a flavor of how important testing already is and will become in the next while.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to go back to Neil. Neil, I asked you about innovation enablers previously. With that comes challenges. Are there any other challenges that are facing testing and certification at this moment in time?
Yeah, and I suspect we'd need more than a 1-hour webinar to really cover this topic out.
Give me the headlines.
Yeah, if I keep it down to 20 minutes, then we'll be doing well. No, I mean, seriously, there's a couple of aspects that come into it, and one that struck me that's through the conversation, and it's really one of the trends that we're going to see in construction, and it's really driven by the decarbonisation agenda, is the repurposing of materials, repurposing of components, repurposing of structures, and in parallel with that, the retrofit of buildings. There's going to be a massive program, undoubtedly, of retrofitting of housing to bring the thermal performance up. That really hooks in with the observation regarding competencies, because patently it's going to be massively site skills dependent, however it's approached. But it kind of takes the test and cert up a level, where you're saying, how do you certify something that's already had its first life? How do you address that? And it's going to bring in some massive challenges along the way. I think the other aspects that we see as a challenge, are really, it's been touched upon, the time and cost of test and cert. Developing any new application is a long, hard road, fraught with cost in resources and fraught with hard costs, before you even start talking about IP protection, marketing budgets, and everything else that goes with it. So anything that can be done to address that by these parallel activities, but also there's some sort of glimmers of goodness coming out of the Construction Innovation Hub, who've got this sandbox model developed whereby you can almost rapidly jump to demonstrator stage and do an awful lot of learning in a real world environment that is safe and risk mitigated. And I think the other point that I would bring is around flexibility and inflexibility, and that trade-off and finding the right point so that the risks are managed, but innovation is still enabled. We tend to see that when you take the advanced material supply chain, construction's actually competing to get them to participate in that supply chain and bring innovations in, rather than what you would see as the other way around. And when you look at the other sectors, so the renewables energy sector, nuclear sector, offshore, they've got a huge appetite for innovation and real drivers and real means of making it happen with rich funding pots, which construction has always struggled to align to. So it needs a faster model, is what I would say in the challenges, but without bringing in more risk.
Sure, bit of a conundrum there, but let's move it along and look to the future now on our final topic. And I'm going to go to Ronan to start us off on this one. Ronan, you currently represent SPRA on a number of different committees, and that's why I'm going to ask you this question, or start with you on this topic. And basically that's ensuring that all members keep informed of industry issues, so they're better placed to tackle things as the environment within construction changes. But looking to the future, how can we build agile testing and certification that is able to respond to these ever-changing market demands?
Yep, thanks, Peter. And we've touched on some of the areas in the discussion this afternoon that are clearly key focal points. But one of the major areas, there's clearly a high demand in the testing and certification segment of the industry for many of the reasons we've discussed, and these include increased testing requirements, evidence of product classification and so on that needs to be there and available to provide the evidence to our products in the marketplace. So working closely with the construction product sector and engaging with manufacturers and the representative trade associations like SPRA in the single ply roofing sector is clearly a means of getting at the core of what product manufacturers' needs and demands are in the area. I think also it's been mentioned this afternoon that early engagement is very much at the forefront of this and has to be the key. And this can provide clearly a good understanding of client requirements and also the pressures that product manufacturers are under can be more readily appreciated by any improved engagement with the testing bodies. And just to give you an example of how that can work in practice, we at the Single Ply Roofing Association and other trade bodies in our sector have run workshops with the BBA, for example, for our members. And this has been a very welcome means of engagement between both the testing body and the manufacturing sector. It's given manufacturers the opportunity to raise issues in a collective sense that affect everybody. And it's also at the same time given the testing organization a chance to respond to some common concerns that clients have and hopefully allay their fears early on in the process. So this means that the testing and certification sector has to be open and transparent and as Hardy mentioned himself, which was a good clarification point, prompt in reaction to customer needs. And it clearly can be a very challenging and complex market. And we also know that some manufacturers require more assistance than others in terms of guidance regarding the type of testing and certification needed. So they will naturally look to the testing sector for that guidance. So clear guidance and support to product manufacturers throughout the process of engagement with the testing authority, testing body, is important. And as stated earlier, not all manufacturers have the same understanding of the testing and certification process. So that needs to be explained, and they need to be, in some cases, held by the hand. And that can all happen through a more closely aligned engagement process. A consistent approach is also required to ensure that manufacturers are clear on what is required of them to ensure the efficiency and the promptness within the system to make the process, run smoothly for all concerned. And one other point, and we have to come back to this, concerns capacity in the testing sector. We've touched on the cost element today, and it needs to be cost effective, but there also needs to be the capacity there. And there needs to be enough space that enables reasonable timeframes for manufacturers to get their products tested. And if there is a bottleneck here, it will impact negatively the building of the agile industry that we would all wish for and we hope for in the future as we go forward.
Fantastic. I'm just going to finish before we go to some questions and answers, which there are quite a lot of questions to go through. We won't get through all of them, but we will answer them after the webinar and get back to people. Hardy, I just want to come to you finally, in terms of the ever-changing market demands. What do you see in the near and distant future in terms of these changing demands?
I think we, as the BBA, find ourselves in the fortunate position in that we engage with many stakeholders, Dame Judith, ISSG, the government, various trade bodies, trade associations. So we're in a very fortunate position of being able to understand what the proposed changes are, and we therefore have a responsibility to pass that on to our clients and to our peers within the construction industry. So that's the first thing, is as things change, and there's a lot of change at the moment, there's a much higher level of government involvement through the OPSS, through the review of construction product testing, etc. A report we await quite eagerly. So these are things that we would like to be the eyes and ears of on behalf of the industry and share that with him. Maybe we can't change the pace of change, but at least we can try and make it simpler for people to ensure that they understand exactly what's happening. Secondly, I also think we have a far more proactive role to play, which we are keen to do. We engage very much with individual clients. If you take an example, if you look at roofing materials with Ronan on the call, if there is one group of people that have seen every new roofing product certified in the UK for the last 30 years, it will be the BBA. What does that information and that intelligence and that knowledge mean to the industry? Can we help not only individual clients, but the industry as a whole to raise its game collectively? Can we contribute to that? So those are the sort of initiatives we are keen to participate in.
Fantastic. So what I'm going to do now is go to a few questions for the whole panel. There was a few questions that came in that are specific to individuals or specific to specific sectors within construction industry. I think we'll probably answer them later on. I want to give a general view. Before I do that, just some interesting information coming from the polls that we set. So we asked 3 questions. The first one was, does testing and certification help or hinder product innovation? 72% said it helps. Secondly, is current testing and certification making the construction industry a safer place? 72% said yes. And finally, can the construction industry thrive without the sharing of data? 83% said no, it can't. Which leads me on to the first question, which I thought was a nice segue, from Jonathan Williams. And he said, the world is a safer place through the free, open and timely flow of information. How open should the certification industry and processes be, and how rapidly should changing data be pushed out? So would anybody like to start with an answer for that one?
Well, we've moved down a route of developing customer portals, because our firm view is that if a customer buys a delivery or the amount of product from us, he doesn't just buy the product, he buys the data associated with that product, and that he should have access to that via a password system through a portal. And that data it's not just technical data. It may be the carbon content, it may be the tensile strength, but it could be carbon footprint data, it could be delivery miles, it could, so all of that data belongs to the customer once he's taken that material. So we're a firm believer in that as a route, because a contractor and client, there may be 30 people that want different pieces of data to satisfy their daily needs. So we are opening up those portals at present and working out systems by which we can make them accessible for our customers. So I don't know whether that's answered the question. I don't know whether how long we retain the data. I'm not sure whether it replaces other data, but I think we've all talked about digitization, and it is the key to moving forward. I mean, look at the poll. Can the construction sector thrive without the sharing of data? 84% say no. So I think that answers it, doesn't it? We've got to find a way to provide it.
Yeah.
Jamie, I think that's a great.
Sorry,
Neil,
go on. Neil, were you just about to say something? Then we'll.
I think I was ahead by a nose. The opposite view to that, and I think it's because we sit by a lot of innovators going through that development process. If a company's investing, say, a couple of million in developing a product or an application and so on, they want to exploit that investment by protecting their IP. And that is a real dichotomy of how you share that data and information. There won't be many companies that will invest that level in there and then say, let's make it public domain, open access, so everyone can do the same. They look to exploit that investment for a number of years, and possibly even longer, by protecting it by patent. So there's a real challenge there. I think my personal take is the test methodologies that are developed and the certification types that are developed should be public domain, because that is hard learning, so that future entrants to that market can see what the mountain looks like that they need to climb. And arguably there's better value for the whole supply chain in not having to revisit how do we test and certify something that looks remarkably similar to something that's already present. But it's not straightforward. I can see with something that's established, like steel rebar, yes, it can be very open domain because it's well established. But with something genuinely new and innovative, there's going to be a want to protect that IP.
Can I just come in, Peter?
Sure.
I think it comes down to for what purpose. How open should the certification and industry be and processes be? If, for example, you use the building research established, carry out a test on a particular component, you are handed at the end of that test process a confirmation of the performance achieved, and you need necessarily to share every little bit of information relating to that. But because the BRE is based saying this is a performance it achieved. So I'd be trying to say to what purpose, and then we could understand how rapidly changing data should be pushed out. There's no question in my mind that if the components that have been tested have changed, then that test data then becomes invalid and it's another test. So I'm just not sure about to what was about how long we should be. It comes back to the point I was making about intellectual property and the investment in innovation. It's a difficult one.
Yeah, for sure. Hardy?
Thanks, Peter. Just coming back to Jamie's point and also Neil's point, if I may. So, Jamie, absolutely agree on the client portal. We've recently introduced one. I've seen the joys of what that can do for our clients. We have a very long way to go in terms of what it can give, but a start has been made. Also, the data, distribution of data, I think the BBA has often seen itself as a content generator. We are moving to being a content generator and distributor. We need to make that information available in ways that people find it valuable and useful in their particular application. And that also means moving some of our more traditional timescales. I think we have had fairly static data with a review every 3 years, etc. That will have to change. With a new way of working, all the information will be captured not in a PDF but in a digital database, and to make adjustments through a standardized database is a lot simpler. If we want to change the performance criteria of a product group, we can make that fairly straightforward, even though it may affect multiple products. So that's moving towards dynamic data. And Neil, just your point on protecting IP, this is where a credible third party like the BBA can help, because you can share with us in confidence your test results, your performance criteria, and we can substantiate claims made without you having to release your commercially sensitive IP to a wider audience.
Okay, fantastic. Right. I know we're coming up to the end, but I want to just get this one question in because it links to some things we were talking about today, and also individuals within the construction industry, the human beings that actually run the construction industry that we can't do without. And it's from Anthony, and he asks, he asks what role could the BBA play, but I think this is more what role could the industry play and testing and certification play regarding the competency of people installing products, systems and components on construction sites. So I suppose, Hardy, let's start with you, and then we'll open it up to anybody that wants to finish this conversation. Oh, Hardy, you still with us? Okay. So, did anybody else hear that question that I asked there, or?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I dropped out, I'm afraid.
Okay, no problem.
Yeah, no.
I'll ask Ronan to begin with then. Ronan, what role do you think the wider construction industry in testing and certification has to play in the competency of people installing products and systems and components actually on site?
Well, it's a good question, clearly, because I think today, with the whole debate moving as it has been over the last couple of years into the whole competence sector for our industry to respond, we need to look at competence all the way through the system. And there's a lot of work going on through the IRG and the industry response group that is to the Hackett report in terms of trying to deal with competence and how do we deal with competence. And the working group structure that has been set up since Grenfell as being tackling with this and putting a lot of effort and time into this whole area, understandably so, because we're trying to make sure that it's not only competence in products that is important and vital, but it's competence in the people handling those products right through from manufacture, procurement, design, and of course installation. And the role that testing can have in there, for example, whether it's by a particular body or not, at least in our sector, we tend to look at it from the point of view, the training and the verification work of that training that is being put into people to develop competence in our installing manufacturers. In the case of SPRA, the product manufacturers are training the installing contractors. And that's something that as an association we get involved in terms of their work and looking at the standards that the people have been trained to by the manufacturers, because they're dealing with their products. So you have got a situation where the product being manufactured, the competence of the individual, in our case, single ply roofer, is being developed by the product manufacturer, which we hope ends up in a better quality finished project for the customer and client. Now, like everyone in the industry, we have to go and enhance and develop those areas, because the whole of the construction industry needs to be operating in, if not an identical, but a similar pattern to try and make sure that the way that products and systems come together, produced by manufacturers, are actually installed at the end of the day in that particular way and verified as being installed correctly. So there's a role for us all in that sector, be it a testing body perhaps, but certainly in our case, the trade association gets involved in that in terms of working with the product manufacturer, and indeed working with the specialist contractor to try and develop standards or training courses or whatever it may be that enhances that whole process. So I do see a linkage between the competence of individuals handling products and what are we doing as an industry about them. Are we training them? And the best training is developed in many cases, at least in our case, by the product manufacturers. As a trade association, we need to be enhancing and supporting that whole opportunity, because competence of individuals, not only the installing individual, but throughout the system, the people who are in technical capacity within product manufacturers, within contractors, they need to be able to have these levels that ensure that what we are delivering at the end of the day is indeed what is designed and verified in terms of performance as we go forward. So I see a strong linkage there between the two, and I think the industry is starting to try and gear up to bring this much wider and deeper, in fact, right across the construction sector.
Fantastic. Hardy, are you back with us? I'm not quite sure if you heard that last conversation. And that
I joined in about 2 minutes ago. Yeah, I did pick up the last bit.
So yeah, excellent. This, final question, and we'll leave it to your good self to answer. Ronan gave a really comprehensive and neat answer, which you heard parts of. But the question came from Anthony, and he was asking what role could the BBA, that was in his actual question, but we opened it out to the actual industry itself. What role could the BBA play regarding the competency of people installing products, systems, and components on construction sites?
So, Peter, who was that question for?
That was for yourself.
Okay,
you
so
dropped out as I was asking it, so Ronan picked up the mantle there.
Okay, so how important is the people aspect, essentially, in all of this?
Yeah, the people installing.
It's massively important. So if you look at the BBA competence, we are predominantly known for our BBA Agremont product certification. We do also do a lot of people certification through approved installer scheme, competent person scheme, PAS schemes, etc. Not as well known for that, but that's something we are currently boosting quite significantly. And then we're looking to add a third element, which refers to a third P, which is place, because arguably great products installed by great people don't always give a great result. And we need to understand whether I noticed that Mike Ormisher made a comment in here about off-site manufacturing, where finished products are actually assessed and certified. Well, we need to look at whether that is possible for products that are not only manufactured off-site but also on-site manufactured products. Can they be retrospectively assessed to be safe and to be secure and fit for purpose?
Fantastic. Chaps, I'm going to end the discussion there, just to say that we've had a lot of people say thank you for the discussion, really really interesting, good presentation. Thanks for sharing ideas. Lots of thank yous all round. So thank you very much for all your time. Hopefully you've got something out of it yourselves and found it enjoyable. Thank you everybody that stuck with us throughout the whole hour and a little bit. Apologies for going over, but really, really insightful and interesting. So that's it. Thank you very much to the panel. Thank you, Ronan, Andrew, Neil, Jamie, and Hardy. Thank you to the BBA for sponsoring, FutureBuild for hosting, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.
And thank you, Peter.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thanks.
Thank you,
Bye.
Peter. Thank you. Bye-bye.